I've noticed something fascinating about Cyberpunk 2077 lately. Not in terms of the story or in the updates, but more in the way people talk about it. Every few months, it seems to quietly climb back into conversations, Steam charts, and into, I finally gave this a shot, and wow, posts. It feels less like a game we've moved on from, and more like a world people keep orbiting around. Night City went from being a laughable meme at launch to this weird comfort zone for a lot of players. And that would already be a cool comeback story on its own, but there's a bigger question hanging over it now. What does that mean for the Cyberpunk sequel? CDPR has been pretty open about The Witcher's future. We've seen tech teases, dev breakdowns, even rough timelines. When it comes to Cyberpunk's sequel, though, the tone is different. Fewer flashy reveals and big trailers, more quiet hiring and subtle hints in interviews and job listings. On the surface, it looks like they're just simply working on the next Cyberpunk game. But once you start lining up everything we know, the new North American studio, the people they've brought in, the engine swap, the cities they've used for research, it doesn't look like a simple sequel. It looks like they're building something much larger around this series. So let's break down why Cyberpunk 2 is shaping up to be way bigger than most people realize, not just in scale, but in what it could mean for the future of CDPR, for open-world RPGs, and for this universe as a whole. One of the easiest things to miss about Cyberpunk 2 is that it's not being built in the same environment as 2077. CDPR didn't just update a roadmap or shift a few leads around. They created an entirely new studio structure specifically for this game. The sequel isn't coming out of their HQ in Warsaw or the old Red Engine workflow. It's being developed out of a dedicated North American hub with teams in Boston and Canada. That alone tells you the sequel isn't treated like another project. It's treated like a reboot of how the franchise is made. The talent they've pulled into this new team isn't random either. A lot of the leadership on the Cyberpunk sequel comes from people who stepped in after 2077's rough launch and helped turn the ship around. The game director is the same person who led Phantom Liberty, the incredible expansion that basically earned back the trust the base game lost. If you're handing someone a sequel this important, that's pretty much the person you want steering it. They've also brought in designers and producers from studios that specialize in massive interconnected systems, people with backgrounds in games like The Division, Hitman, Diablo, Guild Wars, and even large-scale MMO content. These are developers who understand how to weave gameplay pieces together so the world feels reactive instead of segmented. That appears to be the key difference here. Cyberpunk 2077 was made by a team learning a new engine, juggling a new genre, creating a first-person game, and building systems they'd never attempted before. Cyberpunk 2 is being built by people who already lived through the disasters, cleaned it up, and now get to start with a clean slate and a modern toolkit. This isn't the old, ambitious CDPR trying to sprint ahead of the industry. This is a more experienced, more realistic studio building a Cyberpunk game with actual stability under its feet. So, once you see the direction they're hiring toward, that becomes even clearer. One of the biggest clues that Cyberpunk 2 is aiming far beyond what the first game attempted is hidden in some interesting looking job listings. CDPR has been quietly hiring network engineers, back-end architects, and multiplayer designers for over a year now. Not contract roles or small experimental teams, these are full leadership positions basically meant to build long-term online systems. That alone tells you the sequel isn't sticking to the same formula as Cyberpunk 2077. The first game launched as a strictly single-player RPG, and even though early marketing hinted at a multiplayer mode, it was eventually scrapped. Not because they didn't want it, but because the original game was on fire and every available hand was needed to put it out. This time, multiplayer isn't a maybe, it's baked directly into the foundation of the sequel. Now, that doesn't mean CDPR is secretly building an MMO or chasing live service trends. If anything, the studios they've hired talent from point in a different direction. A mix of immersive sim experience, large-scale mission design, and co-op system work suggests something more flexible, something where players can share a space, take on missions together, or dive into side content. Think less about giant lobbies and more about unexpected co-op moments woven into a story-driven world. The kind of setup where two friends can drop into a district, get distracted by a fixer gig, and somehow end up dismantling a whole block's worth of trouble without ever touching a traditional multiplayer mode. I made a video on this already, and I do have some concerns about multiplayer, but I definitely see the desire for it. Feel free to check out my thoughts on it, I'll leave a link in the description. If they're aiming for a city that reacts to players in real time, with layered districts and vertical areas feeding into each other, having online architecture behind the scenes suddenly becomes a lot more important. This isn't just about letting you invite a friend, it's about supporting a world that feels alive, whether you're solo or not. The bigger point is this: CDPR is adding multiplayer because the scale of what they're attempting to build kind of requires it. The most surprising rumor about Cyberpunk 2's world didn't come from a leak or a dev interview. It came from something much simpler, where the developers decided to travel. A few members of the team visited Chongqing, China, and if you've never looked up this city before, it's basically the closest thing we have to a real-life cyberpunk environment. Not the neon for the sake of it style you see in movies, the actual layered and incredible density that looks engineered for a sci-fi action sequence. Chongqing isn't built outwards like many cities. It's built upwards, through itself, and over itself. There are places where you step out of a building's 13th floor and suddenly find yourself at street level. Train lines pass directly through residential towers. Walkways connect skyscrapers in ways that feel less like urban planning and more like insane level design. It's the kind of city where you can stand on a balcony, look down, and not immediately understand what part of the city you're actually looking at. That's probably why it caught the eyes of the Cyberpunk team. If you're building a sequel that wants to be bigger, not just in map size, but in how players move through it, you need a location that naturally challenges how open-world games are structured. Horizontal spaces are easy. We've been seeing that since GTA 3. But true verticality, stacked districts, overlapping streets, multi-layer navigation, that's still rare to see. Chongqing offers a blueprint for that kind of complexity. It seems to fit Cyberpunk's tone perfectly. The city's mix of brutalist concrete, glowing signage, tight corridors, massive transit systems, and sprawling megastructures looks like it was designed by someone who binge-watched sci-fi architecture videos for a week straight. Now, obviously, this doesn't confirm the sequel is set in China. The real takeaway from this is more interesting. The team is studying places that challenge traditional city design, places where navigation itself becomes part of the identity of the world, and where missions can happen above you, below you, or across a suspended walkway without ever leaving the same block. When you combine that kind of complexity with a studio leaning more heavily into multiplayer systems, the potential becomes much clearer. It's a sign that the sequel's world might be built to feel alive in a way Cyberpunk 2077 couldn't realistically support. And all of this becomes even more believable once you look at the engine they're using this time. One of the biggest differences between the first Cyberpunk and the sequel isn't the team, or the city, or even the direction of the project. It's the engine underneath it. Cyberpunk 2077 ran on CDPR's in-house Red Engine, a powerful tool without a doubt, but one that came with a long list of limitations the studio had to work around. Red Engine could make gorgeous cinematics and dense environments, but it wasn't built for massive vertical navigation, large-scale systemic interactions, or the kind of multiplayer features the sequel seems to be aiming for. Every new feature the team wanted meant building tech from scratch. Cyberpunk 2 isn't dealing with that problem. It's being built in Unreal Engine 5, and that changes the ceiling on what the game can attempt. Unreal Engine is designed for worlds with ridiculous detail. Districts stacked on top of each other, busy skylines, tight alleys, huge interiors, without forcing developers to handcraft every texture or polygon. Its streaming technology handles complex geometry in a way that keeps performance manageable, even when the world gets complex. This matters a lot for a city inspired by places like Chongqing, where you might have 10 different layers of streets, bridges, and platforms all visible at once. In Red Engine, that kind of layout would have been a technical and time-consuming puzzle. In Unreal, it's something the engine is built to support. Lighting is another big part of this shift. Cyberpunk 2077 leaned hard into its neon haze and nighttime glow, but rendering those scenes took an enormous amount of optimization. UE5's lighting system, especially its dynamic reflections, means the team can push darker interiors, bright signage, rain-soaked streets, and shifting time of day effects without each one being a custom headache. Then there's the part most players don't think about, which is basically development comfort. Unreal Engine is used widely across the industry, which means new hires already know how it works. Tools, plugins, and workflows exist for almost every situation, so the team isn't reinventing wheels just to test a new idea. That alone cuts down on delays and lets designers build things faster, break them faster, and iterate without constant delays. The result is a sequel that doesn't have to fight against its own technology the way the first game did. It can use its resources to focus on world design, AI, missions, and systems instead of engine limitations. And that shift in stability sets up another important part of the story. CDPR is building games in a completely different way than they used to. The story behind Cyberpunk 2 isn't just new tech and a new team. The studio making it is operating under a completely different philosophy than the one that built Cyberpunk 2077. To be honest, this might be the biggest shift of all. After the launch of 2077, CDPR didn't just push out patches and call it a day. They reworked massive chunks of their production pipeline. They changed how teams communicate, how features are planned, how QA is involved, and how early prototypes get tested. A lot of this came directly from the lessons they learned the hard way. Delays, scope problems, miscommunication between studios, and an engine that slowed everything down. Those problems didn't magically disappear, but the structure around development isn't the same anymore. Phantom Liberty is the clearest proof of that. It was built during one of the most chaotic periods the studio had ever gone through, and it still ended up being one of their strongest pieces of content in years. The same leadership that pulled that off is now running Cyberpunk 2 from the beginning, not stepping in midway through a crisis. Another major shift is how CDPR handles planning. For years, big ideas were greenlit early and refined late, which is backwards for modern AAA development. Now they've flipped that process. Pre-production lasts longer, prototypes get tested earlier, entire departments are involved sooner, and the studio has gotten more comfortable saying no to ideas that would cause problems later. You can also see this change in how they talk about timelines. CDPR used to hint at dates they couldn't meet. Now they explain exactly where each project is in the pipeline without promising specific years. It's a more transparent approach, which is honestly refreshing to see, and it lines up with how the rest of the industry handles long-term franchises. Cyberpunk 2 is the first full game built entirely under this new structure. New workflows, new communication practices, new expectations, and a far healthier understanding of what a modern open-world RPG actually requires. It's not the same group of developers being stretched thin across two continents. It's a team built for one goal from the start. So, that brings us to the part most fans don't want to hear, but is necessary to understand why the sequel is shaping into something much larger. Cyberpunk 2 is still years away, but that's actually a good thing. Whenever people talk about Cyberpunk 2, the first question is always the same. So, when is this thing actually coming out? And the honest answer isn't thrilling, but it's not doom and gloom either. CDPR already confirmed that Cyberpunk 2, internally called Project Orion, officially entered pre-production in 2025. And based on how the studio now structures development, that stage lasts a lot longer than it used to. They're not rushing into full production with unfinished ideas or half-tested systems. They're building the foundation first, then expanding outward once everything is stable. CDPR has also been, surprisingly, straightforward about timelines. According to the higher-ups, once a project enters pre-production, it usually takes around 4 to 5 years to reach a finished state. Not a teaser trailer or a quick vertical slice, an actual shippable game. So, if you apply that logic here, we're looking at 2029 or 2030 as the realistic window. I know, for a lot of players, that probably feels like an eternity. But for a game this ambitious, the long wait is part of the plan. Unreal Engine 5 is still evolving. Its tools are improving fast, but the true strengths of the engine won't fully mature until the end of the decade, when studios have more experience with it and hardware finally stabilizes. By the time Cyberpunk 2 ships, its technology won't be fighting early engine growing pains. It'll be arriving in the sweet spot, where developers actually understand how to push UE5 at a large scale. Hardware matters here too. Whether the game launches near the end of the PS5 generation or the start of the next one, it'll benefit from stronger consoles, wider SSD adoption, and PCs that can actually handle dense urban environments without melting. Cyberpunk launched at an awkward moment, both too early and too ambitious for the hardware people owned at the time. The Cyberpunk sequel has the advantage of aiming for a future where those limitations aren't quite as tight. The other angle here is the multiplayer systems take longer than traditional single-player content. If Cyberpunk 2 really is building some form of shared world or co-op functionality, that alone adds years to the timeline, especially when the goal is flexibility rather than a rigid online mode bolted onto the side. So yes, the wait is long, but it's long in a way that gives the sequel breathing room to be the game CDPR actually wants to make, not the game they're forced to rush out. It's time that allows the tech and hardware to catch up, and the team to refine the new systems without repeating the mistakes of the past. The important thing is this: the long timeline isn't a warning sign, it's a sign of ambition. And all of it sets up the most important shift happening around Cyberpunk, one that's less about development and more about how players see the franchise now. I think the most surprising part of Cyberpunk's comeback is the shift in how players talk about the series now. When Cyberpunk 2077 launched, it was a cultural punchline, not for the world or the story, but for the state it released in. The jokes drowned out almost everything the game actually did well. Fast forward a few years, and the conversation feels completely different. People don't bring up Cyberpunk just to laugh at it anymore. It became one of the most interesting redemption arcs in modern gaming. Phantom Liberty helped a lot with that, but the real shift happened in the years after players re-entered Night City on their own terms, without the negative noise surrounding launch. The world and writing aged well. Even the systems that buckled at release started to stand out once the technical issues were resolved. That change matters for one simple reason: Cyberpunk 2 isn't inheriting a mess, it's inheriting that positive momentum. The pressure CDPR felt during the first game isn't the pressure they're feeling now. Cyberpunk 2 is an opportunity, and the team working on it isn't trying to repair the reputation of the franchise. They're trying to build on a world that players actively want to return to. The community is also in a very different place. Back in 2020, expectations were sky high and almost impossible to meet. Now the hype is built on something more grounded, genuine curiosity. Players want to see where the series goes next, what the next city looks like, how the world evolves, and what kinds of stories CDPR wants to tell with a clean slate. It's rare for a franchise to get a second chance this strong. Most studios never recover from a launch like 2077's, but Cyberpunk's recovery became one of the most stable AAA turnarounds we've seen in years, and that puts Cyberpunk 2 in a position that few sequels ever get: a fanbase that isn't demanding perfection, but is genuinely excited to see how far the series can grow with the right foundation. So, when you line everything up, the new team, the new tech, the new city, the new production approach, Cyberpunk 2 stops looking like a standard follow-up and starts looking like a long-term investment. CDPR isn't trying to recreate Cyberpunk 2077. They're building something that reflects everything they learned from it. A dedicated North American studio isn't a small decision. Switching to Unreal Engine 5, pulling in talent from studios known for systemic design, large-scale environments, and multiplayer architecture definitely aren't small decisions. These choices all point in the same direction: a sequel built to push the series forward instead of rewriting the past. And yes, the timeline is kinda long, but the wait is a chance for the team to shape a world that actually matches the scope players imagined back when the franchise first debuted. A world that feels alive across multiple layers, supports more ways to play, and gives the Cyberpunk universe room to evolve instead of repeating itself. If Cyberpunk 2077 was the experiment, Cyberpunk 2 is the refinement, the moment when this universe can finally grow without the weight of old expectations holding it back. And if everything they've set up pays off, the sequel might not just match the original's ambition, it might deliver the version of Cyberpunk the studio always wanted to build. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it and want to see more, feel free to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.